I'm just saying, listen to your enemies.
Today, I will be addressing the point that if we had just listened to Putin, we would know that bringing more nations into NATO was a red line, and this whole thing could have been avoided. Previously in this series, I talked about the supposed promises NATO made to Russia regarding NATO expansion, and in the second video I discussed whether this ought to be viewed as a provocation. Both of those videos are linked below. Feel free to watch them if you like, but they're not necessary for viewing this video. During an appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast, comedian Dave Smith insisted that if we had just listened to Putin, we would know why it is he did what he did.
I'm just saying, listen to your enemies. And this to Putin, he had said over and over again, was a huge red line for him. Like Ukraine was the big line. And you could look, imagine, take it from our point of view, if like Russia was coming over here and overthrowing the pro-America government in Montreal and installing a pro-Russia government there. Right. And, like this would be seen as, would you call that an unprovoked attack? Right. If we were to go in there and then go overthrow that government?
And sure enough, if you read a transcript of the speech he gave on the day of the invasion, he says that NATO was a major sticking point. It is well known that for 30 years we have persistently and patiently tried to reach an agreement with the leading NATO countries on the principles of equal and indivisible security in Europe. In response to our proposals, we constantly face either cynical deception and lies, or attempts to pressure and blackmail, while the North Atlantic Alliance, in the meantime, despite all our protests and concerns, is steadily expanding. The military machine is moving, and, I repeat, is coming close to our borders. So there you have it. Putin felt threatened by NATO coming closer to his border and lashed out in response to this. A predictable reaction to a hostile action, right? Well, this is a little revisionist history on Putin's part. To people like Dave Smith, who insist that we listen to Putin, I ask, listen to him when? Believe it or not, President Putin didn't always have this attitude towards the North Atlantic Alliance, nor did he always express hostility towards other nations joining. Twice, Vladimir Putin asked NATO representatives if Russia could join NATO. As Peter Conradi writes in Who Lost Russia, Putin asked Clinton if Russia could ever join NATO. Clinton replied, "I don't see why not. I would not rule out such a possibility." Indeed, Putin seemed to have warmed to the idea. According to Alexander Voloshin, the chief of the presidential administration of Russia, there had been a number of discussions in the Kremlin about the possibility of NATO membership, though only provided it shifted away from its Cold War focus to concentrate on terrorism, piracy, and other contemporary issues. This was during the period of time in which the Putin and Clinton administrations overlapped. Putin approached the idea once again early in the George W. Bush administration. Early on, Putin had a good relationship with Bush, as well as NATO officials like George Robertson, the Secretary General of NATO. As Foreign Policy magazine reports, Robertson and Putin enjoyed a highly productive personal relationship. Robertson felt they got along, and Putin seemed to share that view. He told benign jokes and quoted former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Then the 9/11 attacks hit the United States, and NATO swiftly responded by invoking Article 5. Requesting that all members come to the aid of the one that had been attacked. But Robertson's and the alliance's relationship with Russia survived this crisis too. Indeed, Putin upped the collaborative ante. At a meeting with Brussels soon after 9/11, he famously asked me, "When are you going to invite Russia to join NATO?" Robertson said. This was a one-on-one meeting with only interpreters present. And I said, well, we don't invite countries to join NATO. Countries apply for membership in NATO, and then we make a decision. And Putin said, we're not going to stand in line with a lot of countries that don't matter. And Robertson said, fine, let's get down to building diplomatic relationships and see where it takes us. What about when the Baltic states joined NATO? Here, there were mixed messages. As Peter Conradi wrote in Who Lost Russia, like Russian leaders before him, Putin wanted weak, disunited countries along his borders rather than strong, united ones. Only this way could Russia have the strategic depth it needed for defense. Putin spoke of the problem of NATO expansion, saying publicly he did not consider it necessary. Privately, though, there was no repetition of the rancor that had accompanied the first wave of enlargement. According to George Robertson, the Russian leader appeared to be bowing to the inevitable. I met Vladimir Putin 9 or 10 times in the lead up to 2002, and at no point did he raise in a negative way the enlargement of NATO, he recalls, not once. I think Putin thought it was going to happen anyway. This was early on in George W. Bush's first term, when both countries were dealing with the problem of Islamic terrorism. Perhaps there was a mutual feeling of cooperation at the time. Putin even agreed to open Russia's airspace to U.S. military places and helped broker deals with the presidents of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan to help get American troops to Afghanistan. And again, Putin called this round of NATO expansion unnecessary, but he also made the appropriate nods to sovereignty. When asked about the Baltic states joining NATO, Putin said, "Every country has the right to choose the way it ensures its security. This holds for the Baltic states as well. Secondly, and more specifically, NATO is primarily a defensive bloc. I can only repeat what I have said several times. The enlargement of the bloc is supposed to improve international security and the security of its members." Later that year, Putin was even asked about Ukraine's NATO status. And you might be surprised to see how he answered. When hosting a joint press conference with then-Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma, Putin was asked this question: "Is Russia going to join NATO? What major changes do you foresee in the relations between Ukraine, Russia, NATO relations in the future?" Putin answered that, no, Russia would not be joining NATO. "I am absolutely convinced that Ukraine will not shy away from the process of expanding interaction with NATO and the Western allies as a whole. Ukraine has its own relations with NATO. There is the Ukraine-NATO Council. At the end of the day, the decision is to be taken by NATO and Ukraine. It is a matter for those two partners." This, extraordinarily enough, is still on the Kremlin's English website. This quotation is remarkable, especially when you compare it to Putin's speech on Ukraine right when the invasion was first launched. The first half of the speech is Putin talking about Russia's history with Ukraine. Essentially, Putin maintains that Ukraine has never really been an independent nation. It's an offshoot of Russia that has existed almost entirely through Russia's support and good graces, as well as the folly of the Communist Party. So, Putin said in his speech on February 21st, "I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik Communist Russia. The invasion and annexation is part of an effort to remedy this folly." "You want decommunization?" Putin asked. "Very well, this suits us just fine. But why stop halfway? We are ready to show what real decommunization would mean for Ukraine. That means reversing Nikita Khrushchev's decision to give the Crimean Peninsula over to Ukraine." Concerning NATO, Putin still makes his nods to sovereignty, but he believes Russia's security, in certain instances, overrides it. Putin said that Kyiv has long proclaimed a strategic course on joining NATO. Indeed, each country is entitled to pick its own security system and enter into military alliances. There would be no problem with that, if it were not for one but. International documents expressly stipulate the principle of equal and indivisible security, which includes obligations not to strengthen one's own security at the expense of the security of other states. So if Russia feels threatened by a country joining the NATO alliance, it is within its rights to put a stop to that, at least according to Putin. So, what changed in those 20 years between Putin's joint press conference in 2002 and his speech last February? First off, I should just say that Putin, like most other world leaders, isn't above exaggeration, embellishment, or fabrication. If you took his speeches seriously, you would be led to believe that Ukraine is a country crawling with Nazis and ultranationalists, hell-bent on building their own nuclear program, with the full backing of NATO. NATO, furthermore, is just the United States, with all other member states acting as its puppets. This is odd given that when America invaded Iraq, most NATO countries didn't tag along. In fact, some were vocal critics, including Germany, France, and Turkey, who all went on to develop closer ties with Russia in the aftermath. Hyperbole aside, the answer is that relations between the United States and Russia got worse. But that just replaces the question. Why did they get worse? Was Putin just playing nice in those early days, all the while cooking up some devious scheme? That's certainly what some people believe, and there is some evidence to this effect. Consider that his belligerent behavior seems to occur when gas and energy prices are high. Russia, being a major petrostate and one of Europe's primary sources of energy, has way more leverage globally when energy is expensive, as countries are less likely to be critical or retaliate since they desperately need that Russian gas to keep flowing. Furthermore, part of Russia increasing ties with European nations that opposed the Iraq War was building energy infrastructure that made these countries dependent on Russia's natural gas. A decision that Germany in particular likely regrets as of now. There's also some evidence to suggest that he genuinely has become more fearful of NATO, particularly after Libya. He apparently watches the video of Muammar Gaddafi's brutal death to remind himself regularly of what his end could be if he doesn't take appropriate precautions. And of course, there are the more off-the-wall theories, that he's dying or that he went insane during COVID. I will not be entertaining those ones today. It's hard to say exactly what happened to Putin. as I don't know the man's mind. What I do know is that since the fall of the Soviet Union, almost every American president has followed a similar pattern of behavior. When Bill Clinton entered office, he believed that his predecessor had been too hard on Russia during the collapse of the Soviet Union. Clinton believed that if we were just more conciliatory towards Russia and listened to their concerns, we would have a better relationship with the country. And sure enough, things started off great. Bill Clinton and then Russian President Boris Yeltsin were the best of pals. Bill and old Boris, the media called their chummy relationship. No president had visited Moscow more times than Clinton, nor any president since. Unfortunately, the relationship did sour, and NATO expansion was part of that, though Kosovo and Chechnya were part of it too. Furthermore, due to his declining health, Yeltsin eventually stepped down, and his handpicked successor took over, Vladimir Putin. The world was uncertain about Putin at first, and relations between Russia and the United States were not all that they could have been. Luckily, the United States would have a new president soon too. George W. Bush came into office, and this may be hard for some of you to believe. He had campaigned on a humbler foreign policy, one that didn't go searching for fights abroad.
Our nation stands alone right now in the world in terms of power, and that's why we've got to be humble. And yet project strength in a way that promotes freedom. So I don't think they'll look at us in any way other than what we are. We're a freedom-loving nation, and if we're an arrogant nation, they'll view us that way. But if we're a humble nation, they'll respect us.
One of the critiques that the Clinton administration had was that they had been too harsh towards Russia. If we were just more conciliatory and listened to what the Russians had to say, we could have better relations. Sure enough, after the first meeting between Putin and Bush, a journalist asked Bush if he trusted Putin. Bush famously said, "I found him very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. A man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country." Christopher Hitchens was absolutely correct when he said this was the dumbest quotation from the Bush presidency. That's how things started. They ended with Russia invading Georgia in Bush's last year as president, to the outcry and mostly inaction of the international community. When Obama took office, it was the same story. Bush had made many mistakes in the realm of foreign policy, including being too harsh on Russia, as well as alienating them over the Iraq War. Obama was going to set things straight. Sure enough, in March of 2009, he sent his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to Geneva to meet her Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, to launch their Russian reset. Obama, like Putin, had opposed the Iraq War, and seemed willing to turn the page on American foreign policy. Despite the attempted reset, things soured as well. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and sent troops into Syria in 2015, while Obama failed to live up to his red line commitment. When Trump entered the White House in 2017, many Democrats were clinging to desperate and absurd conspiracy theories about Trump somehow being subordinate to the Kremlin. Trump's rhetoric when it came to Russia was as scatterbrained as his rhetoric on everything else. He said nice things about Putin and Russia, but also criticized Europe's increased energy ties to Russia at the UN.
Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course.
This turned out to be a prescient statement. If you ignore Trump's yammering and just look at his administration's policies on paper, though, you'll see that the vast majority of them went against Russia's interests. This was conveniently ignored by the Russiagators of the world. When Biden took office in 2021, there was still a lot of antipathy in the Democratic Party towards Russia, so there were no overtures of goodwill towards the Kremlin. So, if we listen to Putin and the Russian top brass, as Dave Smith suggests we do, we'll see that they've not exactly been clear or consistent over Putin's 2 decades plus in leadership. If we look at many of the presidencies over this time span, we see a similar pattern. They get into office willing to work for better relations with Russia, but when they leave, things are even worse than when they started. No doubt, these presidents and their administrations share some of the blame in that, but by no means most of it, in my opinion. In fact, I would point to the fact that at no point during Putin's regime, despite the changes in rhetoric, has Russia given up its 19th century notions of statehood. What does that mean, though? Political scientist Robert Kaplan lays it out in this lecture.
If you're a Russian leader, and you're Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, thinks geopolitically in a way that most leaders in the world do not, you know that your country encompasses 11 time zones, but has less people in it than Bangladesh, that it has no natural barriers, very few, It has been invaded not only by the French under Napoleon and the Germans under Hitler, but by the Swedes, the Lithuanians, and the Poles as well. And so you know you need a buffer zone in Central and Eastern Europe. You know you need a buffer zone in the Caucasus. You're terrified of China because you have a 1,000-mile-long border with China. And although you do not want to recreate the Warsaw Pact, after all, Putin knows that it was the expense of keeping up the communist empire that basically destroyed the Soviet Union in the first place. You do want a traditional sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe. In other words, the Warsaw Pact may be dead, but Russia is still big. It's right next door. And so the Russian factor still hovers greatly.
While there have been many inconsistencies in U.S.-Russian relations since the end of the Cold War, there has been one through line that hasn't changed. Demand for NATO membership has always exceeded supply. In particular, the peoples that had the misfortune of living between Russia and Germany have been the most eager to join the American-led alliance. In 1993, Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, and Arpad Gons, the leaders of the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary respectively, visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. as honored guests for its official opening. That day, they made their pitch to President Clinton. As Conradi writes, during a meeting in the Oval Office that afternoon, they attempted to convince the president that the only way to maintain peace in Europe and prevent a return to authoritarianism was to allow their countries to join the West's democratic institutions, NATO in particular. Clinton, who greatly respected the pair for their persistence with which they had tackled Soviet power, found their argument convincing. In 2008, NATO held a summit in Bucharest, Romania, to discuss Ukraine and Georgia's NATO applications, along with those of Albania, Croatia, and Northern Macedonia. President George W. Bush nominally supported extending NATO membership to all of these countries, but at the summit, his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, played the neutral arbiter. The countries most vocal in their opposition to Ukrainian and Georgian membership were Germany and France, which is weird because I thought they were American puppets. The ones that were the most vocal supporters were Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. As Conradi writes, the Central Europeans, who saw the issue as a litmus test for the West's will to defend the interests of the former Soviet states, piled in furiously. If NATO had taken that view, that is, resisting expanding NATO to appease Russian interests, West Germany wouldn't have been admitted in 1949, said one. You were one big frozen conflict until 1990, said another. Radek Skorski, the Polish foreign minister, twisted the knife, reminding Steinmeier that it was Germany's fault that Poland and its neighbors had spent 40 years under Soviet domination. It's sad that U.S.-Russian relations are at a very low point now, and I genuinely believe that things could have gone differently. And no, I don't think that the U.S. is blameless here. Many of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe didn't believe that Russia had truly changed after the Cold War, and hedged their bets accordingly. Perhaps it was some tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy, that by attempting to safeguard themselves against martial Russia, these countries helped further provoke Russia into martial action. I don't buy that interpretation, though. Can a nation truly change its nature? I'll be talking about that next video. Stay tuned.